Welcome, everybody. The judges, will introduce ourselves, and then we would like you to introduce yourselves and your teacher and tell us which high school and where in California you are from, since it is such a vast state. My name is Margot Lambert. I am a professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, Blue Ash College. My specialty is early American history.
Sue Leeson. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tandy.
Please go ahead.
Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court. Nice to see you again.
And hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years, but right now I'm teaching high school, some students very much like you. I'm honored to be with you, and I find that this is one of the most fun things I do all year.
So if you guys want to introduce yourselves, please.
Morning, my name is Jonah. My favorite philosopher is Aquinas, and we are Amador Valley High School from Pleasanton, California. I'd like to thank you for listening to our testimony today.
Good morning, my name is William Huang, and my favorite philosopher is W.E.B. Du Bois.
Good morning, my name is Ryan Nava, and my favorite philosopher is John Stuart Mill.
Good morning, my name is Jerry Zan. My favorite philosopher is Hannah Arendt. Once again, we'd like to thank our timer and facilitator, Mr. Calgreen, our wonderful coach, Ms. Sklar, and thank you to all our judges for spending their time with us today.
Excellent. Nice to meet you all and excited for the conversation we're going to have. So we are Unit 1 and we are asking you question 2. The foundation for good government is the rule of law. John Adams once wrote, "Good government is an empire of laws." How, if at all, is the rule of law embedded in our founding documents? What challenges to the rule of law, if any, have we experienced in our history? In what ways, if any, has the rule of law been important to the preservation of a free society?
Rule of law is a familiar but misunderstood term. Contrary to popular belief, there is no objective, all-encompassing definition of the rule of law. Instead, rule of law is merely an ideal with a few fundamental principles we must strive towards. Our founding documents, Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution have attempted, but never fully achieved this idea.
Magna Carta was one of the first attempts to hold a ruler equally accountable to the law. It declared the sovereign to be subject to the rule of law and also documented the liberties held by free men. This would provide the foundation for individual rights and Anglo-American jurisprudence. However, Magna Carta was imperfect, as Section 63 allowed only the noble class to declare war on the king. Therefore, the rule of law requires that citizens are also equally accountable to the laws.
This foundation is seen in the Declaration of Independence. For instance, the second grievance of the Declaration critiques the king's arbitrary enforcement of the laws. When the Massachusetts Assembly passed a law taxing government officials, the king refused to recognize it. Because the colonists had no procedural checks against this improper enforcement, their only option was to rebel.
The grievances in both documents demonstrate two of the most fundamental pillars of the rule of law: equal application and enforcement. The Constitution attempts to uphold both pillars through checks and balances. One of these checks is impeachment, where under Article 2, Section 4, the legislature enforces the laws by trying and removing the president from office if they place themselves above the law.
Although mechanisms like those in our Constitution were designed to uphold the rule of law, they failed to prevent many challenges to it throughout history. The check of judicial review was insufficient in enforcing the laws when President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Although Lincoln justified the suspension as necessary to silence rebels during the Civil War, the court, an ex parte merriment of 1861, found his actions to be unconstitutional. Even after Chief Justice Taney's ruling, Lincoln continued to suspend the writ numerous times. Therefore, this ruling only mattered on paper because the court inherently lacks enforcement provisions.
Furthermore, the check of impeachment failed to enforce the laws against President Trump. His attempts to incite an insurrection and encourage lawless action were done to keep himself in power. However, Congress failed to remove him from office for these violations of the pillar of equal application. While the check of impeachment should have upheld equal application, without enforcement, equal application was meaningless.
Yet, even when laws are equally applied and enforced, they can still be unjust. For example, in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, the Constitution gives slave owners the right to seize fleeing slaves. Technically, this clause upholds both pillars. Therefore, the thin definition of rule of law, which deals with procedures and due process, is not enough. We also need the thick rule of law, concerned with the substance of the laws, in order to promote human rights.
Despite these violations over time, the rule of law has remained vital in promoting a free society. Ideally, we should strive for the thick rule of law. John Locke, in Chapter 13 of the Second Treatise on Government, stressed that the government must provide public and impartial laws establishing stability lacking in a state of nature. This protection of procedural due process would require both citizens and the government to obey the laws. Additionally, by adhering to higher natural law, the government would also protect the natural rights of all citizens. Therefore, the rule of law promotes a free society by providing both stability and rights.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful founding statement there. I think you guys covered a lot of the things we want to talk about today. My first question is, you mentioned Abraham Lincoln and how the Supreme Court declared his suspending the writ unconstitutional, and yet Lincoln ignored that. So would you argue, was Lincoln correct? Is there ever an example when a president may be above the rule of law, or is there never, it's never okay? And I'm looking at this from a historical point of view.
Well, I believe the pardon power granted to the president already puts himself above the law. The founders intended this because the pardon power, while it allows a president to pardon those who have faced a harsh enforcement of the laws, may seem like a violation. It is actually adhering to the thick rule of law by fixing those harsh enforcements of the law that, while they may have upheld a thin definition, did not protect the rights of previous citizens. So in this way, it is violating the law, but it is justified.
In my opinion, I disagree. There is no time when the president should be able to put themselves above the law. This is explored in Ray Don McGahn 2020, in which when the House Judiciary Committee tried to subpoena former White House counsel Don McGahn, he tried to claim that the Trump administration gave him absolute immunity when it came to subpoena. But District Court Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson struck this down, and she specifically cited that presidents are not king, and they are also beholden to the rule of law as well.
I would add that these violations to the rule of law should occur, but only in the most exigent and most pressing of circumstances. I think an example that really shows this, of course, is the 2008 financial crisis, in which you had large banks committing large-scale mortgage fraud. And despite this, the Federal Reserve took the action to bail them out solely because the economy would collapse if the banks went under. And so only during such compelling circumstances should the rule of law ever be broken.
However, I would argue that even the president would abide to the laws, especially of its neighboring institutions. For example, according to a 2002 interview with 2000 candidate Al Gore, he describes that the outcome of Bush v. Gore 2000 was because of the merits of the court was he would, even though the ruling was against him, he would still listen to the court because it was an institution that he must trust and abide by.
You're advocating for something you call a thick rule of law to complement a thin rule of law. And as I understand your definition of a thin rule of law, it's largely procedural due process. So you are arguing for substantive due process. Talk about the history of this country's experience with a recognized notion of substantive due process. Do you agree with it? How would you change it?
Well, I believe the foundation of this idea of substantive due process could be found in the idea of higher natural law, which is a philosophy coined in England. And we can look towards a philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, his first treatise, where he describes that all laws represent the idea of two concepts of human reason, the cognitive and the will. And these reasons appeal to this idea of connection on the vertical sense with a higher being. But today that might be different between us and a higher being, and more towards this idea of rationalism, and that laws must reflect rationalism. And this
Okay,
is
so but just to get to the question, when has this country recognized a doctrine called substantive due process? It was in the 1920s and 30s. Liberty of contract prevents all kinds of government regulation because the goal of protecting private property, and that wound up protecting economic elites. Are you advocating for a return to that kind of substantive due process?
Oh, I believe the history of substantive due process, a thick and thin rule of law as well, can be seen in the 14th Amendment, because that not only protects due process, which is a thin definition, but also equal protection, which would apply more with the thick definition. And by incorporating the 14th Amendment, or incorporating the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment that would apply thick rule of law, apply the Bill of Rights to state citizens. So in this way, we see in American history this application of thick rule of law with thin rule of law occurring first.
That makes me wonder about some of the other some of the underlying issues here. You didn't mention, I think, but it would be logical to think about the Korematsu case and FDR. That was extremely popular. And so it was certainly a democratically popular thing to do. And we'd also probably agree that it violated fundamental ideas of the rule of law, of equality and things like that. Is there a fundamental conflict between the rule of law and democracy?
Yes, I believe there is a conflict between the rule of law and democracy. For example, according to Jeremy Waldron, he describes his critique on democracy is that just because there's a general consensus within society doesn't make it fundamentally morally right. And I believe that we see this throughout history, whether through the civil rights era or in Korematsu, or just because the consensus exists between a majoritarian belief, that doesn't make it right. And there must be checks from our institutions to make sure that there are ethical standards as well.
I agree. We can see this. We can also see this conflict example in U.S. v. Dennis 1948, in which the court did uphold the Smith Act in 1940, which allowed the government to punish the speech that would be they would deem anti-government and pro-communist. But I particularly agree with Justice Hugo Black's dissent, and she stated that the First Amendment, as an essential liberty, must be safeguarded even against the most popular of even the strongest of popular passions. So we can see here how democracy and the rule of the majority can often conflict with the thick rule of law.
I'd have to disagree with my unitmates. As philosopher Hannah Arendt notes in her 1963 work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, democracy only fails, and therefore the rule of law only fails, when the check of the active life or civic engagement in the political realm fails. When you don't have active voices participating in the political realm, tyranny results, and therefore it's not a problem of democracy itself, but simply a problem of political engagement.
I'm curious how your approach to rule of law, you've talked about how it is in conflict sometimes with principles of democracy. We could extend that to whether it's also in conflict with the fundamental notion of popular sovereignty. What about political equality? Does the rule of law not protect political inequality?
I believe oftentimes rule of law is in conflict with equality because it can ignore harsh injustices throughout history that when we just apply equal application ignores the imbalances between certain groups. And Cornell professor Martha Feynman describes this in the autonomy myth, where she describes how more vulnerable groups need more protection from the law, because simply declaring everyone to be equal and declaring that they have human rights does not acknowledge the privileges that certain groups have had and does not fix those imbalances.
However, I would argue that this inequality is a natural byproduct of the rule of law. For example, according to John Rawls of the Theory of Justice, he describes that the purpose of society is the maximum principle, which is to maximize the lowest outcome of society. But in order for this to happen, there needs to exist a natural inequality between outcomes. And from this, we can see that laws, although philosophically would be equally applied, they must acknowledge a sense of inequality that is naturally built into society.
And would your thick rule of law address that problem?
Yes, the thick rule of law must address this problem. We can see this in Ex parte Yarbrough of 1884, where the court ruled that the Enforcement Act of 1870 was constitutional, and this act granted the federal government provisions to stop the Ku Klux Klan from intimidating Black voters. And Justice Miller, in his majority opinion, he stressed the necessity of political equality because he stated that the fundamental right to vote is essential to the federal government and the protections of the rule of law that it contains.
Furthermore, I believe the malleability of the rule of law is also a check that allows us to discern on a case-by-case basis whether or not our laws are reflective of the Rawlsian idea. For example, according to Giltzel v. New York in 1925, this established the incorporation principle, in which cases regarding the Bill of Rights must remain in the court on a case-by-case bias. And this allows the court to review these cases and to discern whether or not a certain amendment needs revision or expansion or in terms limitation on the government.
you all are making some really good points, and you're referencing the court and citing Supreme Court cases. There is a theory out there that the Supreme Court, to this day, there is an imbalance in the checks and balances. It is too strong. You have 9 philosopher kings and queens who all come from they have different ethnicities, but the religion is very similar these days. They all come from Ivy League colleges, have that kind of understanding that they don't grasp everyday Americans. They don't know, they have too much power. And so I'm arguing, how would you address that with the rule of law, and how do we get back to where we were?
Yes, I agree with the premise of your question that there are fundamental flaws in the Supreme Court. Personally, I would disagree with the idea of judicial review. For example, we can look at the Netherlands Constitution, Article 120, which specifically bans judicial review in the Netherlands out of the fear of soft despotism, which is the idea that when the court has so much power to adjust the laws and create new laws, this creates soft power that is not reflective for the community because laws then become too complex.
Moreover, I think we can institute checks, such as in the legislature, perhaps pressing legislation to reverse some of the Supreme Court's decisions. One such case is, of course, Citizens United v. FEC in 2010, in which it was ruled that corporations essentially had the rights to free speech via dark money, via donations. And therefore, by increasing checks, perhaps from the people, perhaps from Congress and legislation, we can provide a check on the Supreme Court. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Tandy.
Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you. Tandy and I did not see anybody from California yesterday. You guys were amazing, are amazing, really well done, really well thought out. I loved your examples. I loved your understanding of constitutional law and history. And I especially loved your response to my last question. I thought that was very, very well done. Amazing, great job.
I would agree with that. Your argument, you're specifying the difference between the thin and the thick of rule of law, and that's a very effective way to make that argument. I tried to organize things. I try to keep things organized by which part of the question you're answering, and you answered it very logically, very consistently. One very picky little detail, when you talk about the mortgage crisis in 2008 and you talk about mortgage fraud, it's really tricky to I think the evidence is pretty solid that people were blithering idiots, but there is less clear evidence that people were intentionally committing mortgage fraud. One of the assumptions we make if somebody knows they're committing a crime is that they try to hide it, and apparently they weren't really trying to hide what they're doing. Everybody knew about it. So I think, I would, that's when I start picking on things like that, I'm really getting out there in the weeds, because I thought you did an outstanding job and really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, I'm so pleased to have gotten to hear you present a second time, because I think I understood your arguments better today than I may have understood them yesterday. And here's where I get to today is you start out saying there's no objective definition of rule of law. It's an ideal, it's a principle, it's never been fully achieved. And I hope you realize at the end of your presentation, you said it's malleable and subject to change. And so I'm going to push you a little bit on whether rule of law is something that's an ideal that is fixed, and we will continue to struggle to attain it, and see how it balances against other principles like political equality and popular sovereignty, or if in fact you see it as something that is changing. And maybe your introduction of thick due process, substantive due process, suggests that that's why it's malleable and where it needs to go. As I did yesterday, I'm going to push you hard on becoming the philosopher kings, deciding what substantive due process should mean in this society. We came to the conclusion that we made a terrible mistake in the 20s and 30s by trying to impose substantive due process on the American people, because it fell into conflict with so many other important principles. One other thing is on Citizens United, and this is where I would hope maybe I could get you as allies. I don't think we have to amend the Constitution to get even with the Supreme Court. Congress controls its appellate jurisdiction 100%. You think the court's gone too far, Congress? Take away its appellate jurisdiction because it doesn't have much work to do under its original jurisdiction. So there is a political mechanism that Congress has not been willing to use if it thinks the court has gone too far and perhaps itself violated the rule of law. Okay, all that said, I repeat what I said yesterday. I came in, I didn't know I was watching a baseball game, and I just saw a ball go out of the court, out of the park. Nice job.
Same.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to hear.